everyone, and welcome to tonight's event for Liberal International British Group, which again we are hosting in conjunction with the Paddy Ashdown Forum, to whom I owe great thanks for helping me organize this session. Just a few points of housekeeping. As always, tonight's sessions, as most of our sessions, will be recorded, so you'll be able to see the recording later if you miss any part of it. And we will have, of course, the opportunity to ask questions to our distinguished guests tonight. Please, could you put your questions into the Q&A section? The Q&A section, ideally not the chat, on your screen, and we're hoping to get to answer as many questions as possible. So thank you very much, and without further ado, I would like to introduce very quickly the panel, but before I do that, just a quick word on the topic tonight. And obviously the events of the last few weeks have been totally overshadowed by the horrendous attack on Ukraine, and rightly people have very much focused on the humanitarian plight as well as the geopolitical implications of that tragedy. And indeed our last LIBG event, for those of you who attended it, was devoted to Ukraine 3 days before the actual invasion started. And I know that very many people have been really focused on that, but sadly there are so many other conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world that are still ongoing and that have slightly slipped out of attention. And tonight we're going to be talking about one such conflict which has been brewing for quite a long time, and which is affecting the countries in the Horn of Africa. Now, those of you who don't know me, my name is Irina van Wiesa. I'm the chair of LIBG. I'm a former member of the European Parliament, and I was vice chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament. When I was at the EP in 2019-2020, the Horn of Africa was already in the limelight for all the wrong reasons. But since then, as I'm sure you're aware, the situation has really become worse and worse. And the last resolution that I'm aware of the European Parliament with regard to the Horn of Africa, and particularly with regard to Ethiopia, was at the end of last year. And it noted that already before the fighting in Ethiopia began, there were 15.2 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Ethiopia, 2 million of whom in the Tigray region alone. Nearly 1 million people living in famine-like conditions, and 5.2 million out of 6 million people in the Tigray are facing acute food insecurity. And it goes on, and I'm sure our experts tonight will be able to give you more up-to-date reports. But you can see that this is a conflict that is clearly not going away, and I think it is the right thing for Liberal International to talk about this tonight, although there are so many other things on people's mind. For that topic, we have 3 very distinguished speakers tonight. And I'm very, very happy to see my friend and former colleague Jan-Christoph Oetjen, who is, of course, a member of the European Parliament for the German Freie Demokratische Partei, and therefore in Renew Europe, a former group. He was elected in 2019, and unlike me, he is still there. His main work focuses on transport and tourism, migration, and human rights in Africa, which is what we're going to speak about, of course, tonight. He has previously spearheaded a European Parliament urgency resolution on human rights breaches in Ethiopia in 2020 and on the humanitarian situation in 2021. His most recent resolution was on the political crisis in Sudan. With that, I'm very, very pleased to pass to Jan-Christoph. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody, and thanks a lot for inviting me. Irina, Happy to see you, dear colleagues. The situation in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa is dire, and the international community, and most notably the European Parliament, strongly condemned the war that erupted from the very beginning, and called on international partners to focus on finding humanitarian solutions while conflict was happening. During this time, we authored 2 resolutions, as you already said, one on the human rights violations in the beginning of the conflict, and the second on the humanitarian situation, including the action that is needed. The war erupted after Tigrayan forces allegedly attacked the military base on Ethiopian central government forces. The background to this escalation was the fact that Tigray held its own elections against the central government's wishes, who had postponed their elections because of COVID. This, including history of disagreement and escalation between both parties, led to a culmination in which the attack on the military base was the last drop that made the war happen. This war has had thousands of innocent victims, mostly civilians, the elderly, women, children, and ethnic and religious minorities. What was a war at the beginning between 2 governments quickly became an ethnically fueled war. Massacres committed by both sides and third parties as well were committed against civilians. Tigrayans were targeted in the capital of Addis Ababa simply for being Tigrayans, and Afarians were targeted by Tigrayans for being party to the conflict. Humanitarian access was severely restricted and humanitarian workers were endangered. Both parties were blamed and accused of this, with some verified and some unverified sources. All in all, it's simply a humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in the country. The conflict now supposedly is calming down. There's a humanitarian ceasefire. This was urgently needed, and nearly 90% of all Tigrayans are in need of humanitarian aid, with over 500,000 Tigrayans being at risk of famine. During the conflict, independent organizations were restricted access, making it difficult to fully verify the damage to the lands and the peoples on both sides. Now that the conflict is slowing down, the governments of each side must make quick work of also combating impunity and holding those accountable who violated human rights, especially against humanitarian law, and perpetrated mass killings that happened during the war on both sides. Restoring trust in the central government, or to ensure stability as a whole, means showing that you're ready to take up responsibility for this. What the international community can and must do now, from my point of view, is to put pressure on both sides of the conflict to uphold the ceasefire and to allow humanitarian aid to enter the province immediately. After this, pressure should be added to find a lasting solution. A ceasefire had already been announced in the past and led to nothing. It cannot happen again. I mean, if we don't have a real ceasefire where humanitarian workers can enter on the ground and help those people in need, the humanitarian catastrophe will be even harder. Both parties need to ensure an inclusive national dialogue to find a lasting solution to a deeply rooted crisis. Ethiopia has the risk of turning into an African example of Yugoslavia. For the security of the whole of Horn of Africa, this must be avoided. We are thankfully, the signs are showing slow but steady improvement. In the European Parliament, we keep a close eye on the situation. And in our political group, Renew Europe, we have a project in the pipeline which we can use at any time to address the situation in the Horn of Africa. But with the recent coup d'etat across the continent and the war in Ukraine, this has slid to the background. We're not longer talking a lot about the situation in Ethiopia. And this is something I want to mention here as well, because as you said, Irina, there is war elsewhere. But we must not forget that despite the war in Ukraine, which is horrible and where we have to support the Ukrainian people in any case, there are wars ongoing in other regions of the world, and we have to look at this. So I've worked closely on the situation in Ethiopia, as you mentioned, but as well on the situations in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Chad, Mozambique, and Sudan. And as you hear from the list, all those African countries are in crisis situation. And all those crises are very much interdependent and have huge consequences for the whole continent and for specific regions. Tomorrow, I will be at the EU-ACP Joint Parliamentary Assembly, which is held in Strasbourg, where I will defend a resolution which I have authored together with other political groups on the consequences on security and stability in West Africa and the Sahel. A resolution that you can imagine was very difficult to push through, as some of the countries affected are represented in the ACP as well by the governments, and leaders of the junta are not represented at all. The EU constantly expresses its concern over human rights violations and political crisis across Africa. And while we condemn all military takeovers, we already show readiness and provide a framework which we can help and support governments to reach. You must understand that in Africa, military power is very important, much more important than across Europe. And if we want to help those who are fighting for democracy, for human rights, sometimes it's important to have a dialogue with those who are in power, who are not necessarily Democrats, but in order to facilitate the work of those who are working closely with us, with Liberal International, with the African Liberal Network and other partners in the region who fight for democracy and human rights, we need to push for dialogue and for things to change. And sometimes you need to take into account those who are in power. I told you that I worked on Sudan as well. I'm happy that there's an expert on Sudan, and I'm happy to hear about this, because I think things may change in countries that are stable, but they need those people that are working for democracy in those countries. They need our support. They need the support from European democracies and from the European Union and from the UK in order to achieve things for the people of those countries. Thanks a lot for listening to me.
Thank you very, very much, Jan-Christoph. And I'm so glad that you and your colleagues are keeping awareness alive on these important issues. Since we don't have any questions yet in the Q&A section, and again, please could people, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A now. But in the meantime, I will shamefully use my position as chair and ask you a question myself, if I may. Jan-Christoph, and I know very little about the geopolitical situation of the Horn of Africa, but you mentioned that Ethiopia risks becoming the African Yugoslavia. And of course, it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious construct, which is, as far as I know, governed by sort of shaky coalition of different ethnic groups. Do you think there is a real risk now that Ethiopia is going to fall apart in the way that Yugoslavia has fallen apart?
I mean, I think that there is a risk, yes. And you need to understand that in the past, the TPLF, so the Tigrayan forces, the Tigrayan party, was part of the ruling party, was part of the ruling majority in the country. And the situation changed. And with such a change, we have now coalitions of different ethnic groups in Ethiopia that stick together against a common enemy, but they are not always real friends, let's say like this. They just have a common enemy. And the war, which was focused on the Tigrayan region at the beginning, swept over to other regions as well. And so I think that that at the end this might end up like this, but all is linked to the question if those people are able to still have a dialogue with each other, and if they are willing to try to find a common ground and a peaceful way forward for the country. And if this depends on the leaders. If the leaders want to go this way, I think the people will follow. But if the leaders continue fueling this conflict by ethnical reasons, or with arguments that are not in our mindset, but that are present in those countries for ethical reasons, this might end up indeed in a country that is split into diverse regions. And we have to see as well that there's a lot of influence from Eritrea, so from the north, coming into Ethiopia, and this gives, let's say, additional complexity to this conflict.
Thank you very much, Jan-Christoph. We now do have two questions from the audience. The first one is from Martin Plot. The war in Tigray is often seen as an Ethiopian war. Yet from the first, the Eritrean army, supported by tens of thousands of Somali troops, was directly involved in the attacks on Tigray. Do we not have to regard this as a regional, internationalized war?
Yeah, that's completely true. As I just said, there are influences from neighboring countries into Ethiopia. So this is not only an intra-Eritrean war, an intra-Ethiopian war, but with troops from other countries going on the ground in Ethiopia. This is clearly has an impact on the whole region. There are governments that are clearly impacted, that are clearly linked to the Ethiopian government and helping the Ethiopian government. So yes, this has not only an Ethiopian internal dimension, but as well a regional, cross-national dimension for the whole of the region. And if you look at the continent, you see that this Horn of Africa has a strategic importance for trade, for shipping, for the whole of the security in the country. If you add Somalia to this, and so this is kind of for us Europeans not only a war where we look at, but where we are implicated immediately because of the routes of shipping, etc. in the region. And if this conflict grows to other countries, and Somalia is not the most stable one of the world, this might end up very, very difficult for the whole of the region.
Yes, thank you. And related to that, a question from Stuart Raymond, who wants to know about Somaliland and the possible recognition of Somaliland, which of course is a former British colony. Do you want to comment on that, Jan-Christoph?
Well, I think that we should not comment on the integrity of countries. I will not on Britain, so I will not on Somalia, I don't think that this let's say that in Somalia there's this risk of being split into several countries, but we have a strong regional power. The same, by the way, in Sudan. I mean, in all of those countries, the central government is sometimes not the most powerful one, but we have regional powers that control kind of those regions, and if they stick together, they kind of make the power in the country, but it's not always the central government who is the most powerful.
Thank you, Jan-Christoph. And finally, a tricky question is always from our mutual former colleague, Phil Benyon. Who is backing Afwerki in Eritrea?
Oh, Phil, happy to have you on board as well. Honestly, I don't know who is behind this, but I mean, in fact, Eritrea is part of this conflict. For me, this is worrying that the Eritrean government is willing to send soldiers over to Ethiopia because this destabilizes the whole region. If other countries, it's always like this, if other countries take part in an internal conflict of a country, this gives the link to that this conflict sweeps over to those countries, and this is why I'm very, very worried for this region, because, as I previously said, this might end up in a mess for the whole of the Horn of Africa.
Jan-Christoph, thank you so much. Since we don't have any other questions, and I know how hectic the schedule is in the European Parliament, I'll give you back 5 minutes of your life and you have a chance to actually find your next meeting. But thank you very, very much for joining us tonight, despite the time difficulties. And I thought it was a really, really insightful debate. Best of luck tomorrow with the ACP conference as well. And we hope to see you soon. And I would therefore like to pass the floor to our next speaker, who is Mehdi Crowther, who is the co-executive director of Waging Peace.
No, actually, sorry, it's going to be me, sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Rebecca.
We have a last minute change.
That is absolutely no problem at all. So our next speaker before Mehdi is going to be Rebecca Tinsley, who of course you will know is a journalist and human rights activist, and her book on Darfur, where the stars fall to earth, is now available in English and Arabic. She founded the charity Network for Africa, which provides mental health support in post-conflict communities. Rebecca, I hope I got this right, the title of your book, but if I didn't, please do correct me. And we look forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Jan-Christoph for joining us. You raised so many of the points that I wanted to make with this slide, and also Martin Plaut's question. If only the world, the international community, did realize how geopolitically important the conflicts in this region are. There is a reason that America and China want and have ports in Djibouti on the Red Sea. And it's the same reason that Russia at the moment is trying to get a port at Port Sudan. There is geopolitical importance here. There's also the Nile, of course, which is literally the lifeline for all those countries downstream, which is why the potential argument about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has the potential to be very difficult indeed. The other reason that this is geopolitically important is, to be hard-headed about it, migration. I think Jan-Christoph hinted at this, but the same issues that are affecting Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea are actually affecting all of that band of Africa right across to Mauritania, and that is climate change and incompetent, corrupt government. In all of these countries, and I hate to oversimplify, but there we go, there's a population boom. There are too many unskilled people who are either herders or farmers. Climate change, in other words, the Sahara moving south at an alarming rate, is meaning there is a competition for resources. Now, if they had competent and not corrupt governments, they would be investing in education, and they'd have invested in infrastructure to transform those economies, but they're not. Instead, the convenient way that so many of these leaders choose is to stir up the residual ethnic grievances and to arm proxies. And that is, I'm afraid, the story of Sudan. This is an old map of Sudan because I'm starting with an old story, and that is the Arab slave trade. You see the Nile going south to north on the right hand of that picture. The Arab slave trade is not a matter of history. It was going until as recently as 1960, when Saudi Arabia still had slave markets and where people from the south of what was Sudan were being kidnapped and trafficked and sold in Sudan's, in Saudi Arabia's slave markets within my lifetime. Of course, it does still exist in Mauritania as well. And there was a trafficking of the African Sudanese from the south of what was Sudan north as recently as the 1990s. Now, the reason I mention this is because, unfortunately, the attitudes, the racist attitudes that informed those elites living along the Nile are still there. And they inform the way that the Black African Sudanese who live in the southern area of that old map of Sudan and the western area of Darfur, it informs the way that they have been marginalized and discriminated against for decades. The Christian, the international community has never really been very interested in Sudan, but because of the persecution of non-Arab, in other words, Black African Christians in the southern bit of Sudan over decades, the international Christian community did mobilize. And because of that, after 2 million people had been killed, South Sudan got independence in 2011. Sadly, the same has not been true for Darfur. And I feel I should stop myself and clarify that identity really is in the eye of the beholder. And it is arguable, of course, that there has been an immense amount of intermarriage. Intermarriage, incidentally, is often a euphemism for rape. But there has been, they self-identify as Arabs, the elites who live along the Nile and who have the power historically, and who have marginalized the people who self-identify as Black Africans. Now, you or I, because we are ignorant of their society, might look at them and think they all look to be the same. But as Freud said, there is the narcissism of small differences. And unfortunately, the racism that has, and sense of superiority that has informed the Arab elites, the self-identified Arab elites living along the Nile, has also identified the way that they have marginalized the people of Darfur. And what do I mean by marginalization? I mean that it has been very, very difficult for a Black African from Darfur or from the Blue Nile or the Nuba people, South Kordofan, to get into university in Khartoum, for instance. What do I mean by marginalization? Darfur, which you see there on the left of your map, the west, that is the size of France. Now, when I visited Darfur in 2004, there were 6 miles of paved road. That's what I mean by marginalization. 6 million people live there. As I said, to bring it forward, there was a rebellion against this marginalization, which began in 2003. And the Khartoum regime, which is Islamist and self-identifying as Arab, they responded They deny this, but they in effect responded by systematically bombing the non-Arab villages in Darfur. And they were followed by people known as the Janjaweed, who are basically self-identifying Arab tribes there, who were led by a man called Hameti, who we will meet later in this story. And they would sweep in to these non-Arab villages after the bombing by the Sudanese Air Force, and they would loot and rape and pillage. And the international community was so interested in this that they didn't even bother to count the number of people who were killed. The tragedy for the people of Darfur, of course, is that as far as the international Muslim Muslim majority nations were concerned, because they were Black African, they were the wrong kind of Muslim, so they didn't care about them. And obviously, Arab countries and Arab-led countries tended to support the Khartoum regime, which has, consistently denied that any of this was happening. The result was possibly 500,000 people out of a population of 6 million Darfuris were killed. 2 million of them are still IDPs, and about 370,000 of them are still in Chad, which is over the border there, as you can see. The killing continues to this day. Absolutely no press interest in this whatsoever. I again feel I should stop myself, and I should stress the fact that the elite in Khartoum is an Islamist elite. Historically, it has been, although a lot of Muslims would argue that this is a horrible, horrible discrediting of Islam. But to give you an example of how this regime expresses its Islamism, in one state alone, that is Khartoum state, in a given year, 40,000 girls and women will be stopped on the street because they are disobeying the indecency laws, because basically that means wearing jeans and on their way to school or university. 40,000 of them in one state alone in 1 year will be publicly flogged. So that is the kind of government that the people of Sudan have been living under. These drawings were collected by Waging Peace. You're going to hear from Maddie Crowther next, who is the co-director of Waging Peace. And one of the Waging Peace team went into the camps in Chad and talked to the IDPs about their experiences. The children drew these drawings. As I said, racial identity really is, ethnic identity is in the eye of the beholder. But look how the children have drawn themselves and the victims and the color of their skin, and the way they've drawn the color of the skin of the self-identifying Arabs who are killing and looting them. Again. Now, I'm hoping you can see on the bottom right hand of this drawing, you can see an image that is from the medieval slave trade. It is Black African women being chained together by the neck and led away to slavery. This is happening in the 21st century. Now, I mentioned that the international community wasn't very interested. They didn't bother to count the dead. They, on one occasion, when the Sudanese Air Force actually painted their planes to look like UN planes so that they could creep up on Darfur villages and bomb them without people suspecting they were about to be bombed. The UN produced a report on this and said the Sudanese armed forces are disguising their planes as UN planes. And the Khartoum regime of Omar Bashir complained to the UN, and the UN actually backed down and apologized for having embarrassed the Khartoum regime, which gives you, I think, gives you a pretty good feel for how much the international community has cared about this. Anyway, they sent in at vast expense a peacekeeping force, even called UNAMID, even though there was no peace to keep. And then they didn't resource them properly. And I remember talking to a Rwandan soldier, and this guy he had been posted with UNAMID, and he told me that they never had enough petrol to go and investigate reports of attacks by the Sudanese armed forces and the Janjaweed on the Darfuris. Never had enough food. They had one bun and one pot of yogurt a day. That was it. And that was, unfortunately, the UNAMID were never given the political backing by the UN in New York that they needed to actually do a proper job. They left at the end of December 2020, and unfortunately the security situation has predictably deteriorated since then. So that brings us fast forwarding to what is happening now. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Unfortunately, the ethnic groups who live around the Nile were never terribly concerned about the suffering of the people of Darfur or the Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, Blue Nile. However, they did eventually get fed up with the economic incompetence of the Islamist regime in Khartoum. Hyperinflation, foreign debt of 47 billion, and unfortunately, a total economic stagnation because the military regime basically ran most of the important bits of the economy, and they ran them very badly. At the end of 2019, the people of Khartoum rose up in fury because they had had enough of the economic incompetence of the regime run by Bashir. And amazingly, they overthrew Bashir, who was then put behind bars. And there was a transitional government formed, incredible bravery, incidentally, by people who took to the streets. There was a transitional government formed, and the idea was that the military would gradually hand over to civilian administration. But unfortunately, in October last year, there was a counter coup, and the military are now back in charge. They've closed civilian space. Incredibly brave people take to the streets on a daily basis and are mown down in the most brutal fashion by the Sudanese armed forces. Just recently, 80 dead, 2,600 people injured, women raped, soldiers walking into hospitals and tear gassing people in operating theaters, lots of political activists, lawyers, journalists behind bars. So it's back to the future. It's back to the way Sudan was, unfortunately, during the reign of Bashir. And they are being helped, of course, by Russia, which wants a port in Port Sudan, and which has lent them the Wagner group to go around brutalizing people. And they're being helped and supported by Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, none of whom would like a successful democratic country in the region. So obviously they want to put a stop to that. I will let Maddie Crowther, who follows me, give you more detail on the current situation. The guy I mentioned before who ran the Janjaweed, he, as in the postmodern way, he rebranded the Janjaweed as Rapid Support Forces. And he now is sort of modeling himself on a populist leader, a sort of man of the people. And so he is, although he is sort of second in charge in this renewed military government, he is falling out with them somewhat, and that is interesting. Not hopeful, however, because it was Hemeti who went to Moscow on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine to show his solidarity and to make sure that he could try and sign a deal so that the Russians have a port in South Sudan. Now, The United States has sanctioned the Central Reserve Police, who have been, because of their brutality, and the United States has also suspended 700 million in aid. I wish I could say that the UK had such a good track record, but during the Bashir regime, the United Kingdom was actually training some of the security services who were implicated in brutality, and the United Kingdom had to stop the training course because it was getting so embarrassing what their trainees were going around doing. I realize I'm overdoing my time, so I will stop now, but there's a shopping list of what needs to happen: the release of political detainees, justice mechanisms to end impunity, a proper transfer of power from the military to civilians, stopping the violence against the demonstrators, uniting and reforming the security services. But at the heart of all this, we just have to remember that the international community, all through the horror of Sudan's last 30 or 40 years, has always taken the word of the people in Khartoum and has believed the lies that they have told, and all the agreements they've signed that they have broken literally by the time whatever representative of the international community was leaving Sudanese airspace. And all of it, unfortunately, boils down to our lack of interest in this area and our inability to ever make sure that there are consequences for breaking our rules. And perhaps at heart, these are the wrong kind of refugees, because all of this goes back to the fact that the European Union was also paying the Sudanese regime to prevent immigrants from getting to the Mediterranean. It is not a happy story, at which point I will hand it over to Irina. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much. It is not a happy story, but it is a story that needs to be told. And I think it's a story that, as I said, is really at risk of being forgotten. And yes, it seems they are the wrong kind of refugees. And the same, I suppose, would apply for those coming from Yemen and Afghanistan that don't quite look like we do, and therefore seem to just gain a lot less attention, but they do deserve our attention. Thank you so much for that really eye-opening contribution. If it's okay with participants, I will defer questions for after Maddie's contribution, because I think she is going to speak to a similar topic, and it is my absolute pleasure to now introduce Maggie Crowther, finally, correctly, who is co-executive director of an organization called Waging Peace, which is a charity that has campaigned on Sudan since 2004. She is also a wider Horn of Africa expert, giving support to the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Eritrea. Maddie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Becky, for setting the scene, though I hope I don't end up repeating some of your points, because I'm sort of going to pick up where you kind of left Sudan and then continue your story a little, but also turn to Eritrea and what is normally its unreported influence in regional affairs, but tonight's esteemed company seems to know the inside score and the truth of matters. And then at the end, I'll just turn briefly to what policy tools or what kind of framework we could adopt that might actually make change for the region more generally. And as Becky, what you highlighted already very well, Sudan today, you know, even in a trajectory that was already pretty negative, is showing a very decidedly not optimistic picture. And this is after a period where everyone was heaping praise on Sudan for the successes of the 2018-2019 revolution. You know, in the months following Bashir's ouster in April 2019, there were lots of legal and institutional changes that seemed, at least on the surface, to embed respect for rights and freedoms and were spoken of widely in the media. things like the signing of a Juba peace agreement, another piece of paper, as you say, Becky, signed between the government and armed movements in Darfur, which happened in October 2020. There was the UN removing UNAMID, the former peacekeeping force, and replacing it with a political mission focused on stability. There were movements to transfer Bashir and his fellow indictees to ICC custody to face justice. And actually there is some positive to note there, which is that Tuesday next week is actually the first time we'll see one indictee, Ali Khashayb, actually stand trial for those crimes. And then there were changes to laws, again, on a surface level, on Convention Against Torture and the repressive laws that were policing morality, which were mostly used against women, as Becky has already highlighted. But it really was surface level. And this is what we've been sort of saying throughout the things, that the core method by which Sudan was ruled never changed much. It was still very centralized and in the control of elite cadres. So there was never something like a legislative assembly or parliamentary system. And in fact, beyond that, there were major tensions that existed between the military and civilian sides of the government, particularly as military actors, as they are prone to do, resented efforts to dismantle their established economic benefits and power structures. And those were particularly the assets that were managed by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, which were the kind of rebranded Janjaweed that Becky spoke to. And that's because a committee that was named the Tamkeen Committee was established to kind of claw back some of the proceeds of corruption and actually hold military companies to account, and that was widely resented by military figures. And it was also largely ineffective because during this period of, in theory, transition to democracy, some of those military actors managed to continue the growth of their personal fortunes, in particular this Hemeti figure that Becky's already mentioned, who runs a highly profitable gold trade, which is managed almost entirely off book and off Sudan's official budget sheet, which obviously undermines the country in various ways. As Becky said, 25th of October 2021, the military seized power. Something quite interesting to note is that the former civilian Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, was actually taken into house arrest in the home of the Sudanese Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah el-Burhan. So he was, I think at the time there was a lot of jokes going around on social media because Burhan was trying to say that he was having Hemeti over almost for a kind of sleepover, but it was clear that he'd been targeted and kidnapped. Political grandees, organizers were arrested en masse, the internet was shut down, and protests were horribly cracked down on. And this is despite the fact, in spite of that, I guess, local decentralized protest groups named the Neighborhood Resistance Committees have had their sort of protesting spirit largely remain undimmed. Protests, demonstrations are occurring on a daily basis. And their policy, which I think has been widely derided as being almost politically naive, but which I would posit that that's not the case. Their policy is one of the three no's towards the military, which is no legitimacy, no negotiation, and no partnership, which is obviously understandable given previous attempts to legitimate, negotiate, and form partnerships have proven to be so deadly to them. And these protests are still met by violence. I think the latest figure I've seen is actually 88 protesters in Khartoum and the injuries of thousands, as well as sort of tactics of arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearance, unlawful detention and torture, which very much mirrors the tactics that we saw under Bashir. But I think it's also important to note that accompanying that violence and well-documented violence in the centre, you're also seeing huge rises in violence in the periphery or conflict zones of Darfur, South Kordofan and Blue Nile. And violence is really reaching levels we haven't seen since the height of the genocide, generating fresh waves of displacement to the very refugee camps in Chad, where the children who drew the pictures, which Becky showed us today, will be reaching adulthood right now. And so despite these sort of three no's policy of the neighbourhood resistance committees, The real worry that I think they have at the moment is that they're going to be forced to sit at the table with the military, or otherwise risk being cut out of a deciding role in Sudan's future, because the international community remains wedded to the idea of a dialogue that's mediated by the UN political mission UNITAMS, but now also in collaboration with the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. But the anti-coup protest movement, as I've said, really worries that that will simply force them into another elite compromise that won't actually meet their core demands. They've tried this, it didn't work. They want the military out of politics entirely, though I respect Jan-Christoph's point that who are you going to negotiate with to get there? And throughout all of this political wrangling, and speaking to the point you were saying, Becky, about some of these strategic interests in the region that are important, is that the economic situation is deteriorating, and the quick action that was taken by the international community to try and freeze figures like Borhan and Hemeti out of the international financial system has exacerbated this. You know, there's hyperinflation, there's a risk of famine, not least as global wheat supplies, including those owned by the World Food Programme, are hit hard by the Ukraine crisis, where they used to acquire 50% or more of their wheat. And the economic crisis has also forced the coup leadership into the hands of new influencers like Russia, who, as you pointed out, Becky, Hemeti, the RSF leader, visited on the day of the Ukraine invasion, though I've had that suggested to me that shows he's less of a strategic partner to Russia than he might think, because I don't think he was aware that invasion was going to happen then, and that the optics might look quite so bad for him. But he provides his illegally obtained gold to Russia to line its coffers and allow it to weather sanctions, as well as provide that access to a base on the Red Sea. And in turn, it seems that Hemeti was offered a chance to kind of strengthen his personal protection from Wagner Group mercenaries. And I think the most important figure in this to mention is also the United Arab Emirates, recently also visited by another military figure, Borhan, and UAE is offering cash injections to Sudan, but also mediation on, in Sudan's crisis, but also on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, where it's been holding a few secret talks. And so, it's clear that Sudan desperately needs those figures, whereas for Russia and the UAE, as well as other actors, they seem to be looking for kind of what they might call strategic economic partnerships, but what other analysts have spoken of as a kind of fire sale or mortgaging of Sudan's assets. But obviously the problem there is that in the rush by both Borhan and Hemeti to price the other out of the political marketplace, it's Sudan's people who are actually suffering. So I know you've had a lot on Sudan. There's a lot of detail there, but I do think understanding Sudan and its Gulf relations is quite key to understanding the Horn of Africa region and the potential futures that might be possible for it. And another country that I believe is essential to understanding the Horn is Eritrea. And I do say that with some trepidation, because I know there seem to be a lot of distinguished Eritrea experts in this room, of whom I do not count myself necessarily among their number. So I would defer to some others in the room for knowledge. But it does seem to me, even with my knowledge, that Eritrea seems to be a missing element in discussions about the region, and ignoring it is something you do at your peril. And part of the reason it's a missing element is by design. Eritrea is a closed book. Everyone knows that fairly reductive nickname, the North Korea of Africa, that it gets, and it's kind of sole running and ownership by the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. And you can pretty much use Eritrea and the PFDJ interchangeably, it sounds like occasionally. They're the sole authority in Eritrea, and the country lacks a constitution. It hasn't got a national assembly that's met for a very long time, or a parliamentary body. There's not been an election since its independence. The media is government controlled, and those that cross red lines are detained incommunicado, and their whereabouts are unknown for, we're talking about some individuals who've passed a 20-year period where they've been detained. And that highlights that Eritrea maintains and operates, it seems, a network of secret prisons where individuals are held indefinitely, often in horridly inhumane conditions. And the facet of Eritrea's repression that might be sort of most immediately apparent to policy actors is Eritrea's national military service program. And it's a mandatory program. Deserting or evading it is a criminal offence, and it's been labelled a form of slavery by the UN, a crime against humanity by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea. And it's the dire consequences of this military service that force so many people to flee Eritrea and seek asylum, including in the UK, where they've been for a long time been among the top 10 countries of origin for those seeking asylum in the UK. In fact, they jostle really for the top 5 spot with their Sudanese brothers and sisters, who also form a huge number of those seeking asylum in the UK. And Eritrea's position as a pariah state means it's largely sort of seems to be outside of Western influence. The points of engagement feel limited, but that doesn't mean in turn it's not seeking to influence what's happening in its neighbours. As people have pointed out in this room, you know, Isaias that has led his nation to war with neighbours, Ethiopia from 1998 to 2000, Djibouti, Yemen, he's backed rebels in Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. And in Sudan, currently, there's some evidence that he might be exploiting tribal politics in the east of that country and playing a role in the not cold or hot, but warm conflict between Ethiopia and Sudan over a disputed region named Al-Fashaga or Al-Fashaga. And Jan-Christoph brilliantly explained the situation in Tigray, and I can't add much to that except to highlight, as many people already have, that from the earliest days of the conflict, Eritrea sent troops. There are allegations that the war itself was a joint initiative sort of worked out ahead of time by Abiy and Isaias. And the presence of Eritrean troops was long denied. It was eventually conceded. And of course, they've been found guilty of the human rights abuses that the kind of joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported in mid-2021. And that includes, I mean, just to note, just the most horrifying incidents of sexual violence I've certainly read in my tenure at human rights organizations, many of which had held evidence of genocidal intent, such as attempts to damage or maim genitalia to prevent future pregnancy among an ethnic group. And of course, Eritrea has also led Somali troops to be involved in Tigray. So I very much agree with everyone else that this is not just a civil war, but actually a regional war. And we shouldn't mislabel it. And it's also important to mention that some of the tactics of war that Abiy might have gained from Eritrea is, how to hide war using total media blackout so that no or little information reaches Western ears, and the confusing array of different social media commentary and disinformation campaigns, which is very much a feature that I see of those conflicts, as anyone on Twitter would have seen if they've commented on this in the past, with the kind of rival no more and no more campaigns and the kind of weaponized Pan-Africanism messages that you can sometimes see. And I promised I'd come on to a solution. And I don't know if I have the one, but I have a suggestion. And I mean, the first thing to say is to repeat, as everyone else has done, there has been some scrutiny of what's happening in northern Ethiopia, in particular in Parliament. We've seen the International Development Committee report on it. We've seen questions in the Houses as well on Sudan, but there definitely needs to be more. We can't allow ourselves to become myopically focused on the latest sort of foreign policy challenge at the expense of these protracted crises. And the Horn of Africa, from Sudan's coup, Ethiopia's regional war, Eritrea's meddling, threat of famine and drought, it feels very much like it's ripe for, it's a powder keg. It really will, it could have such terrible negative effects if we ignore it. And I think the path forward there is to prioritize atrocity prevention as the lens we have going into this. And with an atrocity prevention lens, rather than one just focused on conflict prevention, although that's important, we can do several things. So we can see that the ceasefire or truce that may have been negotiated in Ethiopia is not cause for us to lose focus on achieving full and sustainable peace for Ethiopia. And that's how we might be able to steer it away from the kind of African Yugoslavia situation that Jan-Christoph described, especially when we take into account, as we would with an atrocity prevention lens, the continued risk to certain communities and rising indicators of atrocities like hate speech. And an atrocity prevention lens in turn would also mean that in Sudan, we're not basing our assessment of a healthy body politic on indicators of stability and return to a status quo, or movements towards democracy that have been negotiated with military actors via some sort of elite deal, but we'd then be using indicators like reduced risk of atrocity crimes for minoritized people. And that would force us into a broader perspective of Sudan that, yes, of course, prioritizes killings of protesters in the capital, but treats with equal weight the far higher death numbers and injuries suffered by those in Sudan's peripheries of Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. And some practical small-scale applications of an atrocity prevention approach could be as simple as having a named atrocity prevention lead in embassy teams, and atrocity prevention training for country teams. That's not happening currently, except in some countries like Myanmar, I know has prioritized that. And we could do more than this. We could go the one step further, which would be at a higher level, ensuring that the UK and indeed other locations have a cross-departmental atrocity prevention strategy, which would embed this policy stream into the work of the different departments, whether that's international trade, the Home Office, in the UK, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Ministry of Defence and beyond. So it would allow us to do several things. It could allow us to have scrutiny and oversight of defence cooperation and spending, as Becky, you highlighted. It could better guide asylum and refugee decision-making and avoid the kind of reactive lawmaking which we've seen in the UK, which seeks to criminalise those that arrive from countries like Eritrea and Sudan via so-called irregular or illegal routes, by having better information sharing there. And it would also allow us to do things like match US decisions on Magnitsky sanctions. So as you pointed out, Becky, the US has so far indicted several people, the Central Reserve Police in Sudan, but also 3 individuals and 4 entities in Eritrea, I believe, in connection with the crises in Ethiopia. And the UK at a minimum should be matching those designations, not least as recent events show us that there is some danger in using sanctions as a last resort deterrence rather than in a timely way when red lines are crossed. And they should form part, these sanctions should form part of a strategic sort of theory of change for the Horn of Africa, and one in which highlights really how the UK, supported by others, will contribute to a more peaceable and peoples-led region. And I think what I reflect on sometimes is that the Horn of Africa presents and provides a really timely and worrying test for the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office's development and diplomacy approach. And I think it would be best if we rise to that challenge. So those are my thoughts.
Maddie, thank you so much for a true tour de force and an incredible plethora of knowledge there on the Horn of Africa and indeed both Sudan and Eritrea, which I certainly, most of which I didn't know, and I think the world indeed should know. I will in a moment open the discussion up to the floor. Before I do that, and just in order not to forget, I've been asked to please remind the speakers, and I will come back to Jan-Christoph on that as well. If you could, if you would like to publish your contributions in writing in Interlib, you're very, very welcome to do that, which is a Liberal International publication that comes out monthly. So thank you for that. We have one comment rather than a question, I think, but a very interesting one on the question of slavery from Martin Claude, who is very pleased that Rebecca has raised the issue of slavery in Sudan right now. And he comments, isn't the problem about this question twofold? Firstly, the slavery issue has been hijacked by Americans who are only concerned about the Atlantic slave trade and do not want to have this question diluted by the Sudanese or Indian Ocean slave trade. Secondly, the major anti-slavery organizations like Anti-Slavery International have diverted their attention to modern slavery, and their focus on chattel slavery has been lost. Rebecca, do you want to comment on that?
Well, yes, thank you, Martin. Indeed, yes, on both counts. I am reminded of a story about Malcolm X visiting Saudi Arabia in the year 1960. And his hosts, he was there because he was trying to get money from the Saudi Arabian rulers to fund his political ambitions in the United States. And he was actually taken to a slave market and shown Black African slaves. And apparently he just turned his head away. He did not want to see it because he wanted the money of the Saudis. And so it has followed. I would also mention that it is terribly sad, but to my knowledge, there has not been a single Arab intellectual who has looked at the Arab role in the slave trade. And there are still religious leaders, again, in Saudi Arabia, who justify slavery because there are several surah in the Quran. And in addition, if you speak to someone who's a guest worker from Nigeria or Ghana or Sudan who is working in the Gulf or in Lebanon, they will tell you that people regularly call them abid, slave, to their faces. There needs to be some re-education, to put it mildly. It's not helped by the fact that the European Union has been paying the Libyan government to stop the small boats going across the Mediterranean, and the Libyan, the people running the boats, the Libyan Navy return the Black Africans who are trying to migrate and put them in detention, and they are then ransomed. And they literally phone up their relatives and say, you can have him back for $5,000, or they disappear into slavery. And this is happening right now. And the European Union is actually complicit in this and chooses to do nothing. And Maddie may have something else to say about that.
Well, just maybe to put this in some sort of perspective. So my normal work at Waging Peace is working with individuals who are seeking asylum or have refugee status from Sudan who are in the UK. And it is a regular thing that we will, in the process of taking testimony, which we need to help support them, particularly with their legal case, we will talk about what's happened to them in Sudan. And some of the images that Becky showed highlight what kind of experiences they might be recounting to me. But almost universally, when we say, oh, you went through Libya, and invite them to share something about what may have happened to them in Libya, they are like, Libya was the hell on earth. Libya is something I never want to think about or talk about. And I'm continually amazed that we can ignore that there are slave markets in a state that, as you pointed out, there is quite a lot of cooperation with to try and prevent onward migration. I mean, that is the reality of it. And I think there are all sorts of policy tools, that could be used. And the way to start really is making sure that victims of modern slavery in the UK are treated with the utmost respect and support. And there are currently in the Nationality and Borders Bill, it seems, attacks on the kind of support being offered to those groups. So that's kind of where I'd start, is making sure that the victims we have in the UK are supported as much as we can. But yeah, that anecdote might help put that in perspective. These are people who've had attacks on their villages. They've lived in Chad perhaps for 10, 12 years, but they actually have spent the recent 5 years trapped in Libya's system of slavery and forced labour. And that's the bit that they don't want to talk about. That's where they're traumatized.
Thank you, Maddie. And Becky, if I can add to that from my personal experience, I think sometimes also the borderline between that chattel trade, as Martin puts it, and modern slavery are blurred. I mean, I was volunteering for an organization called Refugees at Home for many years, and 4 years I was hosting a refugee from Ethiopia, from the Oromo community, and she was trafficked by a Saudi Arabian family to the UK. And from all I know, she talked very little about her past. She was held in modern slavery conditions in their flat as a domestic help for many years before she managed to escape in the UK. And I have to say, very sadly, and to the shame of our Home Office, her asylum application was rejected twice, and she had then she was forced to go back underground because she was worried that the police would pick her up at my flat after she had to give my address to the authorities. So that is just about a modern slavery. And I think when we talk about human trafficking and the legislation that is now coming out of many different countries in the West, we have to remember precisely how many different forms it can have. So a big thank you to Martin for that very good comment. Since we don't have, as I can see, any other questions in the Q&A at the moment, may I ask one more, actually just out of interest, and that concerns sanctions. You mentioned sanctions against Sudan, and I vaguely remember from working in sanctions compliance that Sudan was sanctioned by the US as a country, until I believe the revolution against Bashir, and then was taken off the sanctions list. Do you know if it's back on that list, or if there is any discussion of putting Sudan back onto the sanctions list?
I can deal with this first if you want, Becky. Well, yeah, so it was on the state sponsors of terrorism list, specifically for actions sort of relating to its support of terrorism and terrorist actions. So that was lifted at the end of a long process of negotiation and in that transitionary period. And I don't think currently there are plans to put broad country level sanctions back on Sudan, as you know, there's a general reluctance to do that, I think, among policy communities anyway. But I think what is now being considered is the kind of targeted and network sanctions, perhaps those specifically looking at the financial networks of Hemeti. But of course, in the meantime, he's quite busy closing down companies, moving them around, and literally taking bagfuls of gold places. So that might be of limited impact in the future, but it's clear that they are, you know, the financial networks interact with those that are being sanctioned currently with Russia. And I know that in the past, one of the interesting things, the name, I can never say his name, but the man who runs Wagner Group, whose name will be known to you all, but when I see it written down, I just can't say it out loud. He was actually sanctioned for Wagner Group's actions in Sudan and attempts to destabilize, and that was in 2020, I believe. So yeah, there's clearly a lot of different points of intersection there that should be being looked at, but they are more in the network and targeted network sanctions side than broad country level sanctions.
Can I just
Thank you, Maddie. Rebecca, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, if I could, please. Back in 2004, when I went to Darfur at the height of the killing, and when I went there with Lord Oetjen, David Oetjen, former Liberal MP. And when we got back to London, a couple of days afterwards, David managed to get a meeting together at the Houses of Parliament. And he and I both spoke about what we'd experienced. David had interviewed the men in Darfur in the IDP camps, and they'd told him about the horrific things that they had witnessed. And I interviewed the women, and ditto. And we told the audience about all the things that we had been told, you know, people talking about their children being thrown into wells, girls raped, old ladies raped, houses destroyed, animals stolen, entire lives shattered. And, you know, I'll never forget a young woman saying to me, what you need to do, please, is, she said to me, we're Africans and we're pretty good at coping with not much. So it's nice of you to send the blankets and the food, but what we actually need is for you to take the guns away from the people who are killing us. And that is, of course, what we have failed to do in all this time. But the reason I mention this is that at this meeting at the Houses of Parliament was the Sudanese ambassador. And he wasn't at all worried when we were talking about the obscene things that were being done to his own citizens, systematically, ethnically cleansing and destroying their culture and their lives. Didn't turn a hair at this. But when we got on to the bit where we said that what the UK needed to do was apply personal targeted sanctions against the architects of this genocide, like, for instance, travel bans, stopping them going on shopping trips to Paris, making it that they're embarrassing them, that their credit cards are turned down, perhaps removing the British passports that were held by 10 members of the Sudanese regime, that kind of thing. And that was the point at which the ambassador went absolutely ape. And that was an aha moment for me, because I realized these general sanctions, they don't care about that because they don't care about their own people. But the more personal and the more targeted we can make these sanctions, the more impact they will have, as we are seeing now with Ukraine. And that is, of course, what we have always failed to do. And again, if I can continue this anecdote, when David Alton and I were leaving Khartoum, we'd worked overnight to write up all our conclusions in a document, because we knew we were going to be overlapping with Tony Blair at the airport. As we went out, he was coming in to meet Bashir. And so we arranged that we would hand over our recommendations to him. And he thanked us, and he said, he was then Prime Minister, I should add. Blair thanked us and said, well, yes, but you realize, of course, that I'm going to tell Bashir all these things, and I'm sure that we'll sort that out and everything will be fine. And you don't have to worry about it, because I'm going to tell him, what Sudan should do, and I shall be very firm with him. And again, this was an aha moment for me, because I realized he was just the latest in a stream of Western leaders who have gone into African authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorships. And with their arrogance, they have lectured the leaders, thinking somehow that they will be respected and that their words, rather than their deeds, their words will have some kind of impact, and not realizing that these leaders are really skilled at knowing when they should take us seriously. And unless there are consequences to them breaking their word, why wouldn't they just continue as usual?
Indeed, something that we see in another part of the world today as well. Thank you for that. We have a question from Nicole Pichet, who is a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Human Rights Group, in the comments. What is the likelihood of a negotiated political settlement in Ethiopia, and can the international community help with this? Also, how can the Eritrean influence in Ethiopia and the wider region be countered? Finally, can the speaker say something about the current situation in South Sudan? Who would like to take the lead on this one?
I'll do South Sudan if Maddie does the rest.
Go ahead.
Do you want? I'll start. I see. We're doing them in order. Yeah, they're hard questions, Nicole, but thank you. I mean, the likelihood, my answer for both, and I hope it doesn't sound like too much of a cop-out, but I think the second one first is more important in a way, because how can Eritrean influence in Ethiopia and the wider region be countered? It could literally just be known. I feel like it's still an increasingly uphill battle to mention. It almost sounds like people getting a bit frustrated if I'm in a room and say, okay, but what about Eritrea's influence? And they go, yeah, sure, but that's incidental, because we're going to have to get we're going to have to get the combatants to the political settlement. And any settlement that won't involve Eritrea in this, won't involve some of the regional influences that are happening, is going to be difficult to hold. Of course, there has to be a negotiated political settlement between those who are going to be most affected and the most affected communities. But I think if you ignore Eritrea from the start, you're not going to have necessarily a settlement that will last for very long. And I think, so sort of to bind them up together, they are related. I mean, countering Eritrean influence is also giving them not necessarily a seat at the table, but a recognition that they are intimately involved in not just the mechanics of this war, but the reasons for it, its continuation and its possible resurgence, even despite there being a kind of current ceasefire or truce. So I think they have to be more central to how we understand what's happening in Ethiopia, including in anything that is a negotiated political settlement.
Thank you to the questioner for raising South Sudan. This is just such a heartbreaking issue. In 2011, when South Sudan had its referendum and claimed independence, there was euphoria. You know, there was so much hope that these people who had suffered for so long finally could determine their future and have peace and prosperity. And of course, the tragedy was that Dr. John Garang, who was the Mandela character, died in a helicopter crash, leaving two vast egos to fill his shoes. And really the story ever since has been these two vast egos, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, fighting each other to run a country and to rip off all of its resources. They are the caricature African dictatorship. It is just horrible what has happened. Money has been thrown at this country by the international community because so much hope was invested in this fledgling democracy, and it's just been trousered by the elites. And you know, to boil it down to its elements, it is two men of different ethnic groups who deliberately manipulate the residual ethnic grievances of their separate ethnic groups to fight each other because they want to be the top dog. And just, I mean, the African Union, the international community have gone out of its way to try to put in place peace deals, all of which have collapsed. And the latest peace deal, which was signed in 2008, just this week, it does look as if it is disintegrating once again. And people who know an awful lot more than I do about this issue, about South Sudan, they suggest that one of the problems has been that the international community, as so often with these issues in Africa, does not concentrate for long enough. It sort of puts something in place and then goes away. Rather like what I just said about Blair, it tells them what they should do and then it goes away rather than paying attention consistently. And this is what has happened with South Sudan. We've thrown money at it rather than actually finding a political solution to what is a political problem. And tragically, it looks as if it is headed back to really damaging conflict. You know, 500,000 possibly dead already, and goodness knows what will happen now.
Thank you both. And since we do have one more question and 6 minutes left, so if I could ask you for a quick answer, please. From Stuart Raymond comes the question: given that the Liberal Democrats adopted policy on Tigray and the Ethiopian civil war in their recent conference, do we know what steps they will be taking to further that policy?
That's you, Maddie.
I mean, I don't know what their next steps are. I can't comment on what they're planning to do, to be honest. I kind of know what I hope the next steps are, but I don't know what they might be. But maybe I've misunderstood the question.
I know who can answer that question, but unfortunately I can't open up the discussion for live contributions, because if Phil is still here, Phil Bennion, he will probably be able to answer that question. I'm afraid I can't answer it either, because I wasn't involved in the motion. So I can invite Phil to say something in the Q&A a session on this one, but other than that, I'm afraid I have to pass. But I do think it is the credit of the conference that it did allow the motion and then adopted the motion, as far as I remember, almost unanimously, so that we can keep the issue alive. And with that, I really want to extend my huge thank you to all of our speakers, including Jan-Christoph in absentis, who have worked tirelessly on keeping these issues and keeping the atrocities and the plight of the people in the Horn of Africa in the public eye over so many years. And as you rightly said, there are so many conflicts that are sadly vying for our attention. Surely this is one that we cannot allow ourselves to forget. So thank you very much for your contributions. As I said, we look forward to your written contributions if you feel like it for Interlib. We also have a recording of tonight's session, which anybody who has missed part of it can view. It will be uploaded on YouTube sometime soon. And I also would like again to thank Christopher Gliedel from the Paddy Ashdown Foundation for helping with the organization of this event. Thank you, and despite everything, have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.